So in this case, if we jump into policy, my interface is going a little bit crazy this morning. I don't quite know why it's doing that. Disco mode. Okay. Morning, guys. Okay, it's 2025. It's the first few days of 2025. And let's get back into doing some Azure things. Now, we're going to start off the year with just something very, very simple here. We're going to look at creating some tags, and we're going to look at creating a policy. Okay, so we're going to create a couple of resources in Azure. We're going to tag those resources, and then we're going to go and build a policy and actually see what a policy would do to affect a resource running in Azure. The policy we're going to deploy is a regional restriction policy to stop you deploying things to regions that you shouldn't actually deploy to. So what we're also going to do here is we're not going to really do this through the pointy clicky. We're going to do a lot of this through PowerShell. Okay, so we're going to look at how to create resources in PowerShell, we'll look at how to create some tags in PowerShell, apply those tags to systems, and actually go and create policies in PowerShell as well, because there's some slightly weird things to do within PowerShell to actually make that kind of work properly. Something slightly unintuitive as well. So let's get straight into the demo and see what all that kind of looks like. Okay, so here in the Azure portal, we're going to go and launch Cloud Shell. And we're going to choose PowerShell. We're not going to bother with mounting any storage here. We're going to use my default subscription, and we're just going to apply that and wait for this Cloud Shell to actually launch. Now, these Cloud Shells themselves are actually containers, and they're containers that actually run on Linux. Interestingly, they run on a very special version of Linux called Mariner Linux, or it used to be called CBL Mariner. But now if you go and look this thing up, CBL Mariner, what you actually find is this is Azure Linux. So yes, this is actually a fully fledged Linux distribution managed by Microsoft called Azure Linux. So we'll wait for that to pop up. And what we're going to do as well is let's just make that full screen as well. Okay, cool. So now if I just clear that screen out, if I do $PS version table, you'll be able to see here, this is CBL Mariner Linux running on PowerShell version 7.4.5. Now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to create a couple of resource groups. Now to do that, let's go and actually just throw up some very basic PowerShell here to create a resource group named Apple. And that's going to be called new-resource group name Apple location East US. Very, very simple, just straight like that. We're going to create another new resource group as well, and we're going to call that resource group pair. I'm just going to paste that in there and go and run that. Again, it's going to be in East US. Now you could do this in whatever region you wanted to, it doesn't particularly matter. So let's go to portal.azure.com in another browser window, and let's go check that that has actually done what I wanted it to do. Let's go into resource groups. And we have our Apple resource group and our pair resource group. Great. So we can continue on from here. Now, something I want to actually do to this Cloud Shell environment is enable verbose output. Now, this is very, very useful. If I enable this, verbose preference equals continue down here, okay? What that means is when I actually go and run these commands, we'll be able to see a little bit more information coming out of the command itself, okay? So what we need now is a little bit of code, okay? So we're going to create some virtual networks, and what we're going to use is we're going to use a block of code that looks like this. So our resource groups here are going to be called Apple, and our resource group location is East US, and we're going to create 3 VNets here, VNet 1, VNet 2, and VNet 3. So this is defining here just an array of VNet 1, VNet 2, VNet 3, the names that I'm going to need. And then we're going to loop through in a for each loop across each of these individual items, and we're going to create a new AZ virtual network config down here with a default address prefix of 10.0.0/24, and for each of these individual items we're going to create a new AZ virtual network with VNet name. So this $VNet name here will actually loop through each of these in turn when the for each loop processes. So if I go and take this information down here, instead of running it in PowerShell ISE to show you, I want to go and pop that into here. Okay, so let's go and execute that code inside our Azure environment. That's going to lock up for a little bit just as it goes and creates those 3 new virtual networks. And we should see, there we go, we've got VNet 1, VNet 2 succeeded, waiting for VNet 3. How long does things take at Azure? How long is a piece of string? Just because one VNet took 5 seconds doesn't mean the next VNet is going to take 5 seconds. It could take 10, it could take 20. Who knows? Depends on the actual load of Azure at that specific time. So if we go down here and actually have a look at our Apple group, we should have our 3 virtual networks in there. We've got some resources. We've got VNet 1, VNet 2, and VNet 3. Great, so that correct. So what we're going to do now is we're going to create something else in that pair pair resource group over here. So if I just drop back into my PowerShell ISC and have a look at some code, so we can see this one is going to use the pair resource group instead. And instead of creating resource groups, this time we're going to create a new AZ disk. So we're just going to create some Azure disks, and these are going to be resources I can tag in a moment. Same logic, it's got a for each loop. I'll put all this code in later on down in the comments, so you guys can go and grab this, and you can use this for your own purposes if you want to. So let's go and paste that in here as plain text, and go and execute that code. Again, this is going to create those 3 resources. One of the annoying things about the Azure Cloud Shell is there is no like status bar going on here. What it will do is it'll just actually go and output when it's completed. So we should have all 3 of those completed now. If we go back to our resource, go back to pair, go and refresh this information over here. Hopefully, after a couple of refreshes, there we go, we've got our 3 disks. The reason why I've got disks and VNets here to create some resources to tag is because these are just basically the fastest things I can actually build within Azure itself. So what I'm going to do here now is I'm going to navigate to that resource group, and we're going to go and navigate to the Apple resource group, and we're going to have a look at this tag section down here. Now tags are very important for larger infrastructures to label your information so you don't get in a bit of a mess later on. But these are just key value pairs. There's nothing particularly interesting inside here. We can use fruit is equal to value of apple. It doesn't matter what I put in here. I could use potato equals beans. It doesn't actually matter. I don't know why I chose potato equals beans there, but logic still works. You might use something a little bit better than fruit equals apple. You might use things like secure is true or secure is false, or maybe you've got different security levels. Maybe you're doing this via department. Whatever way you actually want to organize your resources is perfectly fine. So if I go down to the pair resource down here and do the same thing, we'll just put a tag in here for fruit is the value of pair. That's all. If we go and have a look at this, I've applied these tags here at the resource group level, okay? So you'd think normally if you're doing something in say like a folder on your computer and you change something on that folder, like for example, change the access control list on a folder, that's going to flow down to the resources underneath, and that might apply to labels. That is not the case here. So if I come down into my pair, for example, and I look at my resources like disk 1, disk 2, disk 3, remember I just enabled this tag fruit is equal to pair. But if I go to the overview section and I go to these individual disks and I go and have a look at the tags, I've got no tag, okay? So that's a little annoying, right? So what I might want to do actually is to go and assign the tags to those specific disks inside that resource group as well. Now to do that, we're going to need a little bit more jiggery pokery, okay? So we're going to need a little bit more PowerShell on here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that verbose preference is definitely set to continue on here so we can see a lot of information come out. And we're going to set this resource group variable to an array or a hash table for apple and pear. So that means if I go to $resource groups, okay, go and run that, you'll see it just outputs apple and pear. So if I wanted to select, for example, the first element within that array, it's apple, and the second element within that array is pear. That's perfectly fine. So our tag is going to be this. So our tag is project equals AZ305 lab work. Notice this at and has different brackets. It has curly brackets rather than actual brackets. I mean, you could call these parentheses and you could call these curly brackets. Some people call them weird things. Some people call them things like gull wings and Scottish brackets. If you don't believe me, look at brackets on Wikipedia. Honestly, these things here, curly brackets, sometimes they're called Scottish brackets. So taking a look at this script, what this is actually going to do is it's going to go and apply the tag of $tag to each of the resources inside that resource group, one after the other. Now I can't multi-select within the portal itself to apply tags to multiple different things. You have to have a for each loop down here to run through this with something like PowerShell or Bash. So we've defined our $tag within the previous command that we executed up here, which was $tag is equal to project equals AZ305 lab work. Okay, now I just pasted that code straight into here, and you'll see the output down here is it's actually crunched through each of those individual VNets and each of those individual disks thanks to those for each loops, and it's applied the tag to each of those individual things. So we've got our outputs down here. Interestingly, the VNets kind of outputted quite nicely, but whoever wrote the command for getting the disks, it outputs not as a not as a table, but as a list by default. This is why there's no consistency inside Azure. So if I pop back over here and have a look at disks, I've got disk 1 set to project AZ305 lab work. That's great. It'll be the same for each of these. So disk 3, for example, is set to project AZ305 lab work. Okay, cool. Again, just bear in mind that the tags that are set on the resource group level up here, like fruit is equal to apple, is not going to apply to the things underneath. They're treated as separate objects. Okay. So what we can do with this is we can go and have a look at things like our cost management and billing. So what's the purpose of things like tagging? Well, the purpose of things like tagging is, well, for example, if I just go look for tags, I can go and look at these individual things. So fruit, apple, fruit, pear, or things like project AZ305 lab work. If I go and click that tag, I'm going to see all the resources that are tagged with that tag across multiple resource groups. Because sometimes you might have things that are across multiple resource groups depending on how you've designed your environment. So now let's move on and let's go and take a look at policies, right? So down here, we're going to create a policy to restrict virtual machines locations. So it's going to resource groups down here, and we're going to create a new resource group. We'll do this resource group here through the portal rather than doing it through commands. And we're going to use this for UK virtual machines. And we're going to select this resource group location of UK South. Okay, we're going to go next on that one. We're not going to bother tagging this, and we're just going to go and create this. Okay. Now, even though we've created a resource group here that is actually in UK South, it means that we can still actually put in resources that are in other locations. Now, just to give you an example of that, let's go into virtual machines and let's click on VMs, okay? We're just going to use normal standard virtual machines here because, you know, if you do search for virtual machines inside Azure, we get some other interesting stuff like Virtual Machines Classic and Virtual Machines Operator Nexus. Don't click on either of these if you want just a normal standard virtual machine. In fact, there's probably no reason for you to ever click on Virtual Machines Classic as of today. That's only if you've got some very old services that are relying on APIs that are like 10 years old now in Azure. And yeah, Azure is like 10 years old. It's crazy. So let's go and create an Azure virtual machine down here. And we're going to create that Azure virtual machine and we're going to pop it into this UK virtual machines location. We're going to call this America VM. And we're going to deploy this not into UK South, we're going to deploy this into East US. We're going to actually hope that there is resource availability in East US because recently it's been quite full. So we'll leave this as a trusted launch virtual machine down here. In fact, yes, we'll leave it as a trusted launch virtual machine and we will just drop Windows Server 2022 inside here. That's fine. And what we'll do is we'll drop in a username of America Admin and we'll give a password down here for this virtual machine as well. All right, cool. So we've got our public inbound ports enabled. We've got RDP3389 enabled. We'll just say we have a Windows license for the moment. And everything else we're going to leave as default because we're just creating a virtual machine inside America along with its associated subnet as well. Because when you create a VM inside Azure, remember, if you don't have an existing subnet, it goes and creates a subnet for us. So let's just go and review and create that. And we'll wait for that to build. So now it's creating that virtual machine in East US. So let's just wait for that to build. It shouldn't take too long in Azure now in 2025. A few years ago, this actually used to take quite a long time, and to create a VM take 20 minutes, 25 minutes to actually build one, but now it should only take a couple of minutes. So while that's actually building, we're going to do something else as well. So we'll leave that rocking. Because we can go off and do other things in Azure, that's not a problem. And we're going to create a policy. Now remember, the policy that we want to build is one to restrict where we want to run virtual machines. So in this case, if we jump into policy, ooh, my interface is going a little bit crazy this morning. I don't quite know why it's doing that. Disco mode. Okay. Let's click on to getting started and click back again. Is it still disco mode? Yep, it does not like it today. Let's hope that doesn't break anything else within this demo. So within this policy, what we're going to do is we're going to go into authoring and we're going to go into definitions. Now, these are some of the default policies that are available to us. In fact, there are actually hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of policies available to us for all different reasons inside Azure. And the one I actually want is one called allowed locations. Okay, so let's go into allowed locations down here. Wait for that to come up and go into the allowed locations policy. Oh look, my deployment has succeeded. My virtual machine is now done. We'll get back to that in a moment. Okay, so inside this allowed locations policy, I don't need to worry too much about the JSON. But if I click assign, what I can do is I can assign this to a scope. I can assign this to a resource group. I can assign this to a subscription level, like to cover everything inside a billing subscription, or I could assign it to a management group, which covers like all subscriptions and all resources underneath. What I mean by that, let's just bring up a very quick image. Okay, it's gonna whoops. Yeah, okay. I realize that I've just gone to Google Images via Bing, but bear with me. Okay, it's early. It's early here. Okay. So if I look for management groups, Azure kind of looks a bit like this. Okay. Here we go. Organize your resources. So if I just open this image in a new tab over here, what you can see is you've got management groups, subscriptions are underneath that, resource groups are underneath that, and resources are underneath that. Now I could apply policies to different levels, okay? So if, for example, I applied a policy to the management group level, that policy is going to flow through subscriptions, flow through resource groups, and hit everything underneath there. So if I put a location restriction in at management group level, it would apply to pretty much everything inside my infrastructure. You can have more management groups inside here as well. If I applied, for example, a policy to this subscription on the left, it would only end up on these resources down here. If I applied a policy to a resource group level, it would only end up on the resources in that resource group. So think of resource groups, subscriptions, and management groups from a policy perspective as like a folder inside a folder inside a folder inside a folder. And you're just applying a permission to the top level of those folders, and it's flowing through to each of those underlying resources. Okay, so let's drop back. Let's get rid of some of these tabs. And let's drop back over here to our policy. Okay, so we had a policy of allowed locations. Let's go next on that one. And the parameters are going to give me certain allowed locations for my regional environments in Azure. So what I want to do down here is I want to come down and I want to go into the allowed locations policy. And I want to make sure that this is only allowing, whoops, I've got a scroll bar inside a scroll bar. You gotta love Azure's UI at some point. So if I scroll down here and I find something like UK South, there we go. So my allowed locations is only UK South inside here. I could select multiple if I wanted to. I'm not going to do any remediations. I'm not going to do any non-compliance messages. I'm actually just going to go through here and we're going to create. In fact, you know what? I'm just going to pop back to the basics tab and just make sure this is enabled, policy enforcement. So this means the policy will take effect immediately, well, a couple of minutes, and affect the resources that are not compliant within the policy, i.e. the America VM. Because if we go back, let's go over here and just check this. If we go back to our resources or resource groups, go back to our UK virtual machines, look, we have an America VM down here that's actually located inside East US, and it's in here running perfectly fine, even though the resource group is in UK South. The actual location of the resource group is more like a tag than anything else. It's not a physical location. Resource groups actually exist everywhere at once. But this is up and running, okay? See? It's currently started, it has a public IP address, everything is happy with that VM. So if this is enforced, it's basically saying this VM cannot exist. So let's go and build that and see actually what happens. So the policy has been created and the assignment has succeeded down here. And let's go return back to that main policy window and let's go and have a look at compliance. Okay, so that's all nicely built. So let's go back into policies. And let's go back over here into compliance. Might take a couple of minutes. There we go. I have my allowed policies here. within the compliance section, and we can see the compliance has not started. It's going to take a while to kind of crunch and whir. But after a few minutes, what you're actually going to see down here is my compliance state, i.e. what is and what is not in compliance within this policy. And we know there's one thing down here, which is going to be that virtual machine, and it's going to be not compliant with this policy that says UK South. Now, that could take 20 minutes, that could take an hour to actually get going. It says not start at the moment, it's been submitted to Azure, it's going to go and process and crunch work through this. You've got to get around to realizing within Azure that a lot of things are not real time. Okay, some things might take a few minutes, some things might take a couple of hours to actually execute. But if I drop back now into my America VM down here and I go and refresh this America virtual machine, I go back into my resource groups, for example, and I go and refresh these resource groups. Notice this America virtual machine hasn't actually been deleted. So even though it's not allowed to exist based on my policy down here, this thing is not going to get deleted. So let's go into America VM. This is still actually up and running. This is still actually running. I do have a policy enforcement, okay? But what's going to happen now is even though it's not affecting existing resources, it will tell me that they're non-compliant and I can go and correct them, but it will prevent me from doing it again. So if I come down here into my virtual machines and I go and create another virtual machine down here, and I, for example, call this virtual machine, let's put it inside UK virtual machines again. Let's call this America VM West down here. We're not going to deploy it in UK South. We're going to try and deploy this into West US. So we've got West US 2. There we go. That's West US 1. Which is a little annoying. It's called West US and West US 2, West US 3. I think it should be called West US 1, 2, or 3, or 1, 2, and 3. But still, it's the way that Microsoft have built the platform. Let's go to Server 2022 and let's go and throw in an America admin down there, add a username and password just because it won't proceed without it. And let's go and review and create that. So now if I go and review and create this, because of the policy, in theory, during this validation, there we go, it says validation failed, click here to view details. So the policy is still crunching and whirring. Let's go and refresh this. Let's go back into policy compliance. Let's refresh this, see if it's still going. Give it a moment. Hey, there we go, allowed locations. Oh, there we go, it's done its crunching and whirring. We have non-compliance. We have 5 resources that are not compliant, which is the virtual machine and the resources associated with that virtual machine, so the VM. We've also got these VNets down here that are uncompliant as well. They're sitting in East US. And the America VNet down here is actually incompliant too. So if I come down in here, we'll notice we can see resource America VM West was disallowed by policy, request disallowed by policy. Now, if you've got errors like this in Azure, sometimes you're not going to know exactly what policy it is that's denying it or why. If you go into the raw error, and this is pretty common inside Azure, we can actually see that this is the name of the policy, allowed locations down here. So sometimes the summaries down here doesn't tell you all the details. It just tells you disallowed by policy, but it doesn't tell you which policy. If we go into the raw error, it will tell you which policy down here as well. That's, again, a great annoyance from my perspective as well, the fact that these errors don't sometimes just say computer says no, and you have to jump into those raw errors to really find out the details of what's wrong. So what you should be able to see there is we have created a couple of resources. We built those with PowerShell, and we had some little loops to go through and build different resources inside Apple and Pear. We tagged those resources accordingly. We also created a policy on top of a resource group called UK Virtual Machines to prove that we can actually block people from deploying things to different locations with one of these very basic policy systems. So let's go and clean up what we've done. So let's bounce up Cloud Shell again. And let's just run a little bit of code just to clean up our lab environment here to make it nice for working with next time. So let's just pop that verbose client in again. And let's just pop in these resource groups, Apple, Pear, and UK virtual machines, the one we want to delete. And now what we're going to do is we're going to loop through each of those virtual machines down here from resource groups in resource groups, and we're going to delete that resource group and all of its contents. Now, just bear in mind, when you're doing this within something like PowerShell, very quickly you can go and trash your entire environment if you don't watch it. So this one, for example, for each resource group in resource groups, remove AZ resource group. That command, remove AC resource group, is going to delete a resource group and everything inside that resource group. So again, when we're looking at PowerShell, be very, very careful with the command you're actually running, because you can cause vast amounts of damage, especially if you have the permission to do so. So that kind of concludes the first quick look through of creating a few resources with PowerShell, creating some tags with PowerShell, and building a policy out to deny the ability to deploy a virtual machine to a location that it shouldn't be deployed. So I hope you enjoyed that quick demo and that quick run through this morning. And I hope you'll join me next time for some more quick Azure tutorials. Have a good one. And you know the routine, hashtag like and subscribe. And I hope you enjoyed this video and will join me next time. Goodbye.